First of all, I would like to thank Harvard-yenching Institute for giving me the opportunity to become a member of Harvard intellectual community and also to participate in today's Around the Table. It was actually Professor Perry's academic works on China that inspired me to take interest in China's civil society back in the days when I was a graduate student. So I would especially like to thank Professor Perry for being my inspiration in this regard and beyond. And I feel greatly honored to be here to discuss civil society in East Asia. As introduced by Professor Perry, I myself am a China expert. But once again, since I'm the only Korean panelist in this round table, I feel obliged to speak about civil society in Korea, although I'm not the exact expert on that issue. But actually, since I'm writing these days the paper, I'm working on paper on comparison between development of Korean civil society and that of Chinese civil society in China, development of civil society in China. So I think that I will briefly introduce the development of Korean civil society in this opening introductory remarks. Civil society in Korea after the Korean War shows great difference between that under authoritarian regimes and that after Korea's democratization in 1987. Korea's civil society under authoritarian regimes until 1987 can be largely divided into three groups. First are pro-government social groups or governmentalized social groups, such as Federation of Korean Trade Unions, in Korean Nochong, and Korean Employees Federation, in Korean Gyeongchong in Korean, and Federation of the Korean Industries, Jeong Jong-ho in Korean. But it is very questionable if we can call these groups as civil society, as these groups actually seriously lacked autonomy from the state control, as their leaders were not self-elected, but appointed by the state government, and as their organization and management were closely supervised by the government. Second are the illegal underground organizations and dissident groups, mainly consisting of students and laborers. These are the groups which were not recognized by the state at all, basically illegal groups. And lastly are few non-political, relatively neutral social groups such as YMCA, but these groups were very few in number and played very little influence, shows very little influence. So these are basically three important civil society groups under authoritarian rules, authoritarian regimes. However, after Korea's democratization, and especially after first direct presidential election in 1987, great change can be perceived in civil society in Korea, in Korea's civil society. In other words, this civil society in Korea's civil society experienced explosive growth since the first direct presidential election, which was held in 1987 as a result of the 1987 June 10th pro-democracy movement. So just as Korea's economy shows a compressed development, compressed modernity, one can say that Korea's civil society also experienced compressed development. Especially after 1990s, the pro-government social groups, which used to lack the autonomy from the state control, slowly gained autonomy from state control. At the same time, those illegal underground organizations and dissident groups, which lacked legality, also slowly gained a legal status and recognition. But most of all, most importantly, new civil society groups started to appear. For example, Citizens Coalition for Economic Justice, 경실련 in Korean, established in 1989, Korean Federation of Environmental Movements, 환경운동연합 in Korean, established in 1993, and People's Solidarity for Participatory Democracy, 참여연대 in Korean, established in 1994. These are one of the most important representative examples of the civil society groups formed during this period. But the civil society after Korea's democratization actually shows very significant characteristics when compared to civil society in Europe and Western Europe and USA, and also when compared to civil society in Japan and China and Taiwan. So I will briefly introduce some important characteristics the civil society, Korea's civil society after democratization in 1987. First is the diversification of the relationships that Korea's civil society after democratization has with the state. Under the authoritarian rules, state-society relationships were filled with conflict, resistance, struggle against the state. However, after Korea's democratization, state-society relationships began to incorporate competition and cooperation as well. Especially, the rapid development of Korea's civil society has led to the acceleration of various cooperation, mutual assistance, competition, and conflicts even within civil society itself. For example, the competition and conflict between Citizens Coalition for Economic Justice, 경실련, and People's Solidarity for Participatory Democracy, 참여연대, is one of the most important examples of this conflict and competition within civil society. Second characteristic is the excessive politicization and ideological factionalization of the Korean civil society after democratization. This is especially noticeable with regard to the policy toward North Korea, where the civil society in Korea was strongly divided into left and right, and progressive and conservative over the sunshine policy during Kim Dae-jung government administration. And even this political polarization within civil society groups affected greatly the political involvement as well. For example, PSPD, the progressive PSPD, strongly supported left-wing governments under Kim Dae-jung and Nomu현, while the conservative, the new right social groups strongly supported the right-wing government of Lee Myung-bak. The third characteristic is the active participation in real politics. In other words, civil society, Korean civil society after democratization have actively participated in real politics, directly joining political circles. This actually, the civil society, Korean civil society after democratization, they concentrated on traditional political, economical, and social issues rather than postmodern issues that has been the focus of the new social movement in the West. So they still focusing on traditional political issues. So they directly participate in central politics, and even they involved in real politics, and sometimes at an individual level, at a group level, they participated and they become politicians. So for example, as an individual, these are some examples how the civil society, Korea civil society after democratization directly participated in real politics, became politicians. For example, as an individual, Park Se-il is one of the founders of the Citizens Coalition for Economic Justice, served as the Blue House, the top secretary for social welfare, and Lee Seok-yeon is the standing representative of the New Right group, served as the minister of the government administration during the Lee Myung-bak government, while the Kim Ki-sik is one of the founders of the PSPD, is now a member of the National Assembly, and also Park Won-sun, also one of the founders of the PSPD, is now the mayor of Seoul City. So also as a group, the civil society, Korea civil society after democratization, has greatly involved in the birth and maintenance of the past administrations. For example, PSPD supported Kim Dae-jung, Nomu현 governments, while the New Right social groups supported Lee Myung-bak governments. So, as you know, according to the Philip Schmitter actually argued that the non-usurpation, in the sense that civil society do not seek to replace the state agents and do not directly involved in policy. This is very essential in the definition of the civil society. So, in Korean case, it becomes very important characteristics, which contrasts with other civil society in other nations. But at the same time, this kind of like active participation in real politics actually led to a hollowing of, it brought about very negative consequence, which is hollowing of civil society, which means that since many important leaders of the civil society groups after Korea's democratization became real politicians, directly involved in real politics, it led to a drainage of civil leaders. This is all the characteristics. Fourth characteristics is most of the activities of the Korea's civil society after democratization pretty much concentrated on in Seoul area and focused on politics at the center. This is actually characteristics, this important characteristics that contrasts with Japanese civil society, just introduced by the Professor Kage. Korea's civil society, as I mentioned, still involved in central politics. So they deepened its involvement in central politics, but gave little attention to regional problems. So great gap began to be created between the civil society in the center and the civil society in regional areas. While the civil society at the center performs various functions, civil society in regional or local areas actually mostly underdeveloped. So lessening the gap between these two has become an important task for the deepening of democracy in Korea today. Lastly, civil society in Korea after Korea democratization has become financially dependent to the state. Actually, it was Kim Dae-jung who established MPO Assistance Act to help civil society groups who played a significant role in Korea's democratization. So because of this act, the civil society groups were able to resolve their financial problems, but they had no choice but to depend upon the state funding for survival. So most of the civil society group became very independent to the state. But it is interesting to see that, I mean, different past administrations actually shows difference in the funding for civil groups based on ideological bias. Once again, Kim Dae-jung and Nomi administrations actually given more fundings to progressive civil groups, while Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye administrations given more fundings to conservative civil groups. So this dependence actually not only a deepening of civil society financial dependency to the state, but also a doubt, but raised lots of doubts about the neutrality of civil groups in Korea. So basically, these are 5 characteristics of the civil society in Korea after Korea's democratization. But as a final note, I would like to emphasize new development in Korea's civil society, functional diversification. In the past, most of the civil societies in Korea focused on political campaign and policy advocacy. However, now the new civil societies began to appear, which involved in service provision and policy suggestions such as think tanks. So these are important new diversification of the civil society in Korea. I will stop here. Thank you.